Hello and welcome to the Rabid Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Like and share this video. Join the Rabid Nation, a nation of people dedicated to normalizing atheism and deconversion by hitting the subscribe button. And if you want to support the channel in a more tangible way, hit the join button, and your membership options that lead to citizenship in the Rabid Nation will be presented to you. Today I'm responding to a video by Redeemed Zoomer called All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes. So today I'm going to take the first half of the video and do the second half later this week. When both are done, I'll put links to each other in the descriptions of both videos so you can go back and forth from one to the other. Now I'm going to be looking at whether or not Redeemed Zoomer actually presents the argument correctly, whether he actually answers it, and his answers actually are in proper response to the argument. If he doesn't, well, you'll probably hear "Okay, Zoomer" a lot. So Redeemed Zoomer, take it away.
Atheists have a lot of arguments, but they never really think of anything new that the church hasn't had answers to for the past 2,000 years. So let's answer them.
Yeah, I'm sure the church has had answers for these for a long while, but that doesn't make them good or reasonable answers. Just because something is had for a long length of time, it doesn't mean that they're good arguments or good responses to the arguments for God's existence. For a long time, people have had, the church has had arguments for God's existence that are philosophical. Almost every one of them has been debunked and unaccepted. Just because something's held for a long time doesn't make it true. You have to evaluate something on other criteria besides the length of time it's been around. It's not proof of validity for either side.
Religion causes wars. Well, actually, only 7% of all human wars were caused by religion, and if you remove Islamic wars, that number drops down to 3%.
So we're going to just confirm that religion does indeed cause war. Thanks for the acknowledgement that the atheist argument is right on this one. I don't, you openly admit that 7% of wars are caused by religion, which is what the statement says. You only really need 2 of wars actually started by religion to make that true. From my perspective as a political science, though, I'd have to ask whether the Encyclopedia of Wars you're using as a source, what their methodology is. Okay, I have a question regarding methodology. Are they saying that there's only one primary cause of every war? I mean, religion might be just a primary cause, but it also might be a secondary or tertiary cause of a war. It's very rare for countries to go to war purely on one reason. It's often much more complicated than that from a political science point of view. Even if the religion in a particular country isn't the primary cause of going to war, it might be considered a secondary one, or at best, religion invents a moral cause for the war as a just war. Just saying that wars are caused by one thing or another, secular or religion, seems overly simplistic. I would also ask, does it take into account colonization wars, which were one-sided, that were in the name both of state and religion, as they seem to be common bed partners? It seems like there would be more than one cause for a war, so I do have a question about the methodology here. And why are you signaling out Islam as somehow it's a different thing than any other religion? The whole contention is that religion causes wars, and Islam is a religion. Why would you pull that out? That's just weird.
A lot of evil has been done in the name of religion. This is true, but the most murderous people in human history have been atheists. This doesn't mean religion is true, it just means you can't use that as an argument against it.
I want to start with a screenshot of your video looking at the lower left. You're using a predictive text to say Hitler was an atheist. But you know that predictive text doesn't go after truth. It tries to anticipate what you're going to type in order to help you search better. The funny thing about the English language is when you type an A-N, then only words that are going to follow it are ones that start with vowels, so you're left with only 5 possibilities. And A is the first letter of the English alphabet, so that doesn't prove anything other than the real possibility you're counting on the ignorance of your audience and how predictive text works. But the same is also true for your article that you post underneath. I decided to read it, and you know what? It doesn't actually conclude that Hitler was an atheist. In fact, one scholar says this probably was not the case. Rather, the best you can say after reading the entire article that Hitler was a deist in many respects, and some with a lot of pagan overtones. The one thing that cannot be said is that Hitler himself declares himself as an atheist. He never does this. So this little piece of work in the corner is presenting a falsehood, an absolute falsehood. Also, Mao, Pol Pot, and you didn't mention Stalin, but I'll throw him in there, Have they really been reported to have killed in the name of atheism? I mean, when I read their histories, it seems like they're more protecting their power. So if a religious organization was a threat to their power, yeah, sure, they went after it. So it is an arguable point as to whether or not we should count these deaths as due to atheism or due to some brutal dictators that just happen to be atheists. But a larger problem is that you never address the argument. There are so many things that could be argued that are worse and evil than death. I would consider the fraud that religion has used throughout the millennia as they present people with false promises and exaggerated claims and then charge a fee. That would be considered an evil to me. The continuing fear invoked by religion that is abusive, the threats, the bigotry, the torture at many times in history, the abuse done in the name of religion that is psychological, physical, and sexual would also constitute this evil. There's a lot of what makes out what people evaluate as evil, and religion around the world have done them all in the name of their religion, but you never address this issue. Sorry, you kind of dodged the question. Sorry, I can use this argument and continue to do so because your defense really didn't address the issue.
If you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be a Christian. Okay, and if you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be an atheist. Everyone's beliefs are shaped by their context.
Okay, Zoomer, you missed the point of the question. The point is whether your religion is the right one. Way to misunderstand the argument, Zoomer. That's the real problem here. You just straight up misunderstood the argument. And yeah, that's the problem. So you didn't really answer the argument.
How do you know which religion is true? Well, everyone, religious or not, has faith in a certain worldview. It's just that some worldviews are called religions and some are secular. But everyone has to ask the question of which worldview best explains the world.
Okay, Zoomer, once again, you didn't answer the question. Unless we are going to get a real answer, which is, I don't know, which is basically what you say. You could have just made this even shorter video by saying, well, we don't really know. That would have been a good answer if you legitimately didn't know. But the question is, how do you know your particular religion is true? I'm going to remark at this point that you don't seem to be willing to provide an answer to the question for the reason that of hope that is within you. 2 Peter 2 doesn't apparently mean anything to you. You really should call yourself Redeemed Dodger at this point, as you practically dodge most of these arguments or questions at this point, and we're only 4 arguments in.
There's no scientific proof that God exists. Well, by definition, science can only prove things inside the natural world, and by definition, God is something outside the natural world. So science can neither prove nor disprove God.
So we are going to definitionally win this argument against this argument at this point by defining our terms. Problem for you as a Christian is if you're going to maintain that Jesus was God, are you saying that he wasn't part of the natural world as a human being? Doesn't this do a nasty blow to the doctrine of incarnation? But more importantly, you disagree with a lot of apologists that say that their God has scientific evidence for his existence. I lost track of the videos that I've watched titled Scientific Evidence for God or something similar, but to me, if God acts in the physical world, there would be evidence for it. If Jesus was a human being, that could be tested by science. I think your theology there is poor, and you undercut a lot of key Christian doctrines if God is purely outside the natural world, most notably the doctrine of the incarnation.
There's no evidence of anything supernatural. Well, that's just not accurate. There are medically documented cases of people with demonic possession speaking in languages they don't know, for example, and people with near-death experiences getting information they never had access to.
Okay, Zoomer. Maybe the argument should be revised as no good evidence. I'm sorry, NDEs really at best. The studies that actually have been about in near-death experiences have kind of shrugged their shoulders. Don't know. The evidence for demonic possession is poor and better explained by natural causes and tongues. Well, yeah, speaking tongue proves nothing to me as a form of Pentecostals. I can tell you that it's a learned behavior. And when the claim of languages they never learned is used, there's always a curious lack of documentation and recording of this, and proof that the actual person didn't know the language ahead of time. You don't really know that. They could be lying. And so the evidence presented for both NDEs and demonic possession is piss poor. And so the fact that you think it's good evidence is kind of telling.
The Bible has contradictions. Okay, you think you found an apparent contradiction that the church hasn't known about for 2,000 years? Every apparent contradiction can be explained by understanding just a little bit of theology.
Okay, Zoomer. Your response is that the church has had answered for these a long time. That is an assessment of whether or not they're good answers. False reasons can be held for a long time that people believe things. Just because the answers satisfy you doesn't mean they satisfy others or me, nor does it make the contradictions magically go away. The one you offer is one that I would agree is possibly not a contradiction, but there are many others that are not so easily dismissed. To really answer these questions, you would have to show a lot of things are not contradictions. There are many of them, not just this one. I would put this: the Bible has a lot of contradiction, and each one of them should be addressed. But you just hand-wave them away. Oh, we have answers for that. I can tell you, though, as someone with a degree in theology, Asbury, class of 1996, that theology isn't the issue with contradictions. It is often the plain reading of the text that has open opposing ideas, like the one I often use. God says in the Ten Commandments in Exodus that he is a jealous God, that his name is actually jealous. 1 John remarks that God is love. But then 1 Corinthians 13 says love is not jealous. One of these statements cannot be true about God if there is not to be a contradiction. I have heard all the excuses about this contradiction and what the theological aim is. But the point of theology is to make excuses for the inconsistency for our notion of God and the inconsistencies and contradictions that exist in the text.
The Gospels were anonymous. Okay, anonymous doesn't mean we have no idea who wrote them. It just means the names of the authors aren't signed in the text itself. But we literally have writings from church fathers who knew the apostles and can verify that they indeed wrote the books named after them.
Okay, Zoomer, I challenge you to give the actual quote from Ignatius of Antioch that says what he says at the bottom of the screen. Because I have read his writings, and he never says that. It is purely church tradition that he and Polycarp were disciples of John. There's no textual evidence for that in their writing. This is pure grade A lying on your part. The quote that you give, he never says. Sorry, the chain of evidence actually isn't there. It isn't that the writers never signed their book. The books are not attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John until the 2nd century, when Christianity was more into being an institution trying to justify itself. But the problem is deeper than this. Each story in the Gospels has no identification as a source, and the Gospel writers couldn't have been present for all those events. They had to get it from some other outside source, and they don't name that source. We don't know where most of the stories come from that the Gospel writers collected. There are a couple of good videos from Paulogia, one of them about the chain of evidence problem when he deals with J. Warner Wallace, and the other about the authorship problem. The funny thing is about both of these videos is that no critic that I have read of them has questioned his presentation of the facts and evidence that he presents, but there are a ton of excuses. I will leave both in the description of the video. But my main point is that they are absolutely anonymous in every sense of the word. You're trying to confuse it with false quotes from Ignatius of Antioch doesn't change that.
The Gospels misquote Jesus. Now, it's true that a lot of secular scholars think the Gospels are a mix of real quotes from the historical Jesus and fake quotes added by the church, but none of them can agree on which quotes are legit and which are not, so we can discard their opinions.
Okay, Zoomer. The important thing is they all agree that there is something wrong here. Their disagreements these scholars have as to what is misquoted is not as important as the one thing that they do agree on, that Jesus has been misquoted. They also agree on what is authentic, but you never even you conveniently avoid the fact that they talk about what is authentically Jesus. You can't just hand wave this away like you think you can.
Jesus never claimed to be God. Yes, he did. He didn't say, "I am God, worship me," but he showed that he was God in many places in all 4 Gospels by doing things that only God can do. It's true that he didn't walk around before his resurrection claiming to be God, because he wanted people to figure it out themselves. That's why he kept saying, "Who do you say that I am?" However, after his resurrection, people figured out that he was God, and Jesus congratulated them.
Okay, Zoomer, so you agree, but you couch it in language that he declared it by his actions, not his words. So why didn't you just say that that is true, that he never declared himself God, but he showed it by his actions, which would have been a more accurate statement? But let's look at your list. Forgiving people's sins is not purely a divine action. You're commanded in the Sermon on the Mount, when it comes to the Lord's Prayer, right after it, that you're to forgive people's trespasses against you, or your trespasses won't be forgiven by God. The point is, human beings are allowed to forgive each other of their sins, and that's a textual thing. Your use of John 8:2 is a little bit confusing because that's the woman caught in adultery, but if you're referring to later on in the chapter where Jesus has a discussion with the Pharisees about who he is, The only thing that Jesus really claims in that whole passage that would indicate that he is eternal is the fact that he says, before Abraham was born, I was. And that's not necessarily claiming eternal, it's just claiming to be older than Abraham. And so it doesn't necessarily follow that Jesus is claiming to be God in that passage. In fact, that seems to be a controversial thing with Jesus' words in John. It's also very convenient that the gospel writers all of a sudden talk about the eternality of the godlike qualities of Jesus when we get to John, which is the last gospel written. It's almost like it's an addition. Matthew 8:2 is not Jesus accepting worship, but a request from a leper, okay? The Lord there doesn't necessarily refer to God. It may just say, hey, I acknowledge your authority as a teacher. It doesn't say the leper worshiped him. And claiming divine authority is done by humans throughout the Bible, or at least they come on the name of the Lord, which is pretty much the same thing. So I'm not sure that you're presenting the idea honestly and with a full understanding, and you're clearly misrepresenting at least one text.
The later one of the Gospels was written, the more divine it makes Jesus seem, so we can extrapolate that Jesus was originally a human figure who got made more divine over time. Alright, maybe some Gospels emphasize Jesus' divinity more than others, but what about Paul's letters that fully confess the divinity of Jesus and were also written before any of the Gospels? So that breaks your pattern.
Okay, Zoomer, so all the Gospels were written after Paul wrote Colossians 2:9. Putting aside the fact that Colossians is a disputed book as far as Paul's authorship of it, and it is, this wreaks havoc on the idea of people being claimed by the church who have written the Gospels, actually wrote them, because Colossians was probably written in the 60s AD, which means Mark has to be written after that and all the rest of the Gospels. This pushes them way back into a later date and not close in authorship like they should be if the apostles actually wrote them. By doing this, you've actually created another problem with this defense. You have to go with the later dates for all the Gospels, making the authorship by eyewitnesses even more of an impossibility. You also miss the point of the argument, which the Gospels show that the stories around Jesus were becoming more and more a growing legend. The latest story has obvious signs of embellishment and exaggeration, which is the point of this argument, and you don't even address that.
The Bible supports slavery. No, it doesn't. Just because there's slavery in the Bible doesn't mean the Bible supports it. There are some Old Testament verses that could be interpreted as condoning slavery, but Jesus himself said that the Old Testament made accommodations to people's sinful state. And also, slave owners in the American South had slave Bibles for their slaves to read, but it omitted a lot of the real Bible, so if the Bible actually did support slavery, this wouldn't have been necessary.
Okay, Zoomer, you're plain out lying on this one too. I'm going to call you a liar here. Leviticus 25 makes it quite clear that it is okay to own foreign slaves as chattel slavery. They were possessions and could be passed on to heirs. This isn't about slavery being in the Bible, but Bible providing rules as to how they should be acquired and treated, and the New Testament constantly admonishing them to be obedient to their masters. This is a complete misrepresentation of what the Bible says about slavery, and it's disgusting. Oh, those slave Bibles? Yeah, you know what they emphasize because I've actually had my hands on one and read it. The slave should be obedient to the masters. I wonder why they would give Bibles that emphasize what the Bible says about being obedient to your masters. What you do here, Zoomer, is lie.
Christianity supported slavery. Well, sure, some Christians did, but all human civilizations have had slavery. Christian civilization was the first one to abolish it on moral grounds. The fact that you're against slavery is due to Christian influence. Also, most organizations fighting modern-day slavery are Christian.
So your answer is, well, everybody has. That doesn't justify the practice. Let's suppose that you're being accurate, which is hard to swallow at this point since I've seen you straight up lie now several times. It doesn't change the fact that the Christians are going against what the Bible clearly condones. In other words, Christians had to disobey the commandments of Scripture to support the end of slavery. I would also say that you don't provide proof that Christian organizations were the first to cut against the idea of slavery. I would say the spirit of the Enlightenment, which was rooted in secularism, started the notions of rights, and one of those rights was liberty for all. And that, of course, led to the idea that slavery should be outlawed. And perhaps Christians just picked up on that. The culture thing provides more of the idea that the Bible is a human book and was written by human beings trying to justify their current behaviors and saying God was saying it was okay. But if God is truly all-powerful and can dictate whatever he wants, he could have abolished it right away. And the fact that he doesn't kind of indicates that he really isn't against the idea.
God killed tons of people in the Bible. Well, it's actually way more than that. God numbers everyone's days. He's the giver of life, so he can take it, especially if people sin.
So, yes, and? So then your God rules by fear like any other ancient tyrant. So you make the atheist argument stronger? Good job.
Atheist countries are more prosperous. Yes, it's true that Northern European countries are very prosperous and very secular, but correlation doesn't equal causation. It's not like atheism causes prosperity, it's that prosperity causes atheism because when people have comfortable lives, they don't feel a need to depend on God. But why are these particular countries so prosperous in the first place? They may be secular now, but they're rooted in generations and generations of Protestant Christianity. If you want an example of a country that's atheist and not rooted in Christianity, look at communist China.
So correlation doesn't equal causation unless it supports your position? That's straight up hypocrisy.
There's 4,000 gods that people believe in, and you're atheist to 3,999 of them. I just go one god further. Okay, this isn't the gotcha that you think it is, because the question of whether some sort of God exists is fundamentally different from the question of which religion is right about God.
Okay, Zoomer, we know that, but the argument isn't about this. It's about which religion is correct. And now you've avoided answering that question twice.
If God created everything, then who created God? Well, God is defined as the uncaused causer. Everyone knows there needs to be a first cause at the beginning of the chain of all events in the universe, and it makes a lot more sense for that first cause to be a personal God who caused things for a reason, rather than some random impersonal force.
First of all, nobody agrees that there must be a first cause. That is just you saying so. Also, if it was an impersonal force with natural laws in action, it wouldn't be random or chance-based. That's an addition that makes no sense given the natural causes for the universe. Apologists like to add the idea of chance to make it seem nonsensical, but that is not what the people who support natural causes for the universe would argue for. There would be no randomness to it at all.
Science disproves God. Well, actually, the Church invented modern science. All the founders of the scientific revolution deeply believed in God, and medieval theologians laid the groundwork for modern science by saying the world was governed by an intelligent creator. That means we can understand the world with our intelligence. And studying God led to studying the world because the world is God's creation.
So how do you explain that atheism is now overrepresented in science now? Perhaps because as time has passed, God is no longer necessary as an explanation, and the more science is done. It should be noted that many scientists also didn't believe in God or lost their faith in God the more they studied the natural world. Even if you accept the notion that theology led to science, then it's simply something evolving from a lot of nonsense to less and less nonsense as time goes by. It's almost like it was a bad step for theology in retrospect.
God is just used to fill in the gaps of things that science can't explain yet. Well, actually, God is the reason for everything, even things that science can explain. It's not one or the other. It's not like everything's explained by either science or God, and the more science can explain, the less God can explain. Really, science can explain almost everything, but God is still behind it all, because science explains the how, and God explains the why.
Actually, science also explains the why a lot, so your argument fails for me here. The why you come up with, this why thing that you come up with, is really not an answer, just a claim on your part, and you don't back it up with any evidence. It is not a fact that others agree to, it's just your opinion. This avoids the fact that science also answers the why question quite a lot as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We'll deal with part 2 of this later, but this has been kind of an interesting dive into this. I wanted to divide this up a little bit because I think it's important to look at Zoomer's arguments. He's trying to, I'm going to say something at this point, he's trying to rapid fire responses to atheists because then it makes it appear to his followers, because apologists, most of their followers aren't atheists or people searching for God. They're actually believers that are looking for rationalizations of why they should continue to believe in God. And so he's rapid firing here because that's a nice technique to keep everybody off balance. Okay, so what it looks like, oh, look how easy it is to debunk these atheist arguments. But in fact, he actually dodges most of them. He should change his name to the Redeemed Dodger because he dodges so many questions here. And when he does answer the questions, sometimes he straight up creates fabrications or lies. So he's a typical apologist that I wouldn't even respect because of that fact alone. The fact that he does the Hitler argument, the fact that he wants to say the Bible doesn't condone slavery when it clearly does, it's like, dude, you're just denying reality here. And you're either very incompetent in your research onto these matters, or you're just straight up being deceptive. And I'm going to go with the latter on this one, because the Hitler thing has been around for a long time. And the straight up fact is, you're not looking to people. Zoomer at this point has already demonstrated he's not looking at his audience as people that are actually going to follow up the research. The fact that I read the article that talked about Hitler's religion is something that he wouldn't expect out of somebody watching this video. He's just putting it up there, so he's hoping that it'll deflect, any research into the topic. So once again, propaganda piece? Yeah, probably. But I'm stopping here. There's only 19 arguments in, and there's going to be more arguments in the second video, but he tends to get shorter with his responses to those arguments. And at argument number 20 here, he starts to go into the problem of evil arguments, and I want to keep all those together, so we're going to stop here. So thanks for stopping by. I appreciate every like, share, and subscribe. You guys are awesome. I want to give a shout out to my members, to my citizens, and to my Rabyd citizens. Thank you very much for your support of this channel. It really makes it enjoyable what I do. Thank you very much. And, as always, live your best life. You only get one go around, and then it's over. So make sure you're taking all your time, money, and opportunities and giving them to yourself, the relationships with people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.